In this second video, we're now going to configure the control point ingestion monitoring software to start to monitor the frameworks. To configure the frameworks, we need to basically go into the configuration tab at the top left-hand corner. By selecting the configuration tab, at the very top we have the option or the facility to add the frameworks within our control point environment. So the first stage, and I'm going to go through now and configure a file system framework, is to basically tell the system where the framework resides. So what server does the framework actually reside on? Has it been installed on? So in our particular case, it's on this particular server. The next box down requires us to tell the system what ports has been allocated to this particular framework. This is a standard file system framework, so 7250. We then need to tell it what the actual framework is. So it's a file system framework. And we also need to assign a timeout value. The timeout value is basically should the framework not respond, either due to it's hanging up, or it's not working at the moment, or if there's been a connectivity issue, then the software will, after a period of time, in this case 5 minutes, will time out and retry at the next scan interval. The next box down basically is the scan interval. And in this release, we now have two mechanisms for acquiring information from the framework and also from the Metastore. So the traditional way was to have a scan interval where we would poll the devices for information. We've also introduced in this release the ability to use an event handler where the framework or the Metastore will automatically inform us or inform the application when a task is started and also completed. So the beauty of using the event handler is that the polling mechanism, although we will still use, can be dramatically reduced. So for example, if I don't want to use the event handler, I would simply enter a scan interval, and that can either be typed in or entered from the drop-down box. If I wanted to select 60 seconds, so once a minute, and if I don't want to use the event handler, I need to enter A0, and then I can add the settings to the config file. In our particular case, we are going to use the event handler. So I'm going to enter a much greater scan interval, so every 5 minutes, 300 seconds. This is really just meant for almost like a catch-all, so just to refresh the system when there may be low or no activity. Because I'm going to use the event handler, I need to basically assign a network port where I'm going to listen for the events to be triggered by either the framework in this case or the Metastore. So the listener address we usually recommend, and this is really up to your individual environment. A recommendation from us is that you take the port number that's assigned to the component, so in our case 7250, and then increment it by a number of ports. Usually around about 5. So we're going to use a 7255. Now beforehand I have checked that this port is not allocated or reserved. We can simply leave it as that would work, but we want to make it fairly unique because we are going to be monitoring several file system connectors, several Metastores, and several other connectors through this one event listener port. So I'm going to give it some additional qualifiers to make it fairly unique, or additional strings to make it unique. What we found as just a standard is to introduce the name of the server where this listener is going to reside. And then also, because we could, for example, have multiple file system frameworks that we're monitoring, give it some form of unique name. So if we call it file system 1. So I'm now going to add these settings to the configuration file. So these are stored permanently, and upon restarting the application, we would attempt to go and start to configure this device and start listening for any jobs that enter into a start or completed state. Let me add one more just to show you another example. I'm going to configure a Metastore. So first the question is, where does the Metastore reside? The port associated with the Metastore, what the particular framework that we're configuring is. In our case, it's the Metastore. Timeout, 5 minutes. 5-minute timeout is pretty standard for most. Again, we're going to use the event handler, so I'm going to introduce a 5-minute scan. And where the event handler, as I mentioned before, it's taking the socket or the port that's associated with the component and increasing it to a known level. We're recommending 5, and then adding some unique qualifiers. So again, as we mentioned before, adding the name of the server where we're listening, and also what this particular device is. Now, because we could have multiple Metastores, we haven't in our environment, but if we did, we're going to give it something which just makes it unique, and then add. So I'm now going to close the application down and perform and restart it, simply so that we shut all down the background threads, and basically during the shutdown we issue a termination to any of the asynchronous threads that are running, and by restarting this, it just makes it clean. We start everything up from the beginning. So the installation you've probably seen has put an icon on the desktop, but there's also an option inside the startup for us to go and actually run the code. We're going to run it from the desktop. So what has happened this time is that we've now discovered not only the connectors, but we've also discovered the framework and the Metastore. As per the connectors, we're displaying the server that the framework or Metastore is installed on, the port, the elapsed time or the estimated time, and this is the amount of time before all the jobs have been processed through this particular component. So if we had 20 jobs, maybe 5 processing and 15 queued, this is the estimated time it will take before all those jobs have been executed, processed, and have finished. You can see by looking down, we have some values that basically indicate the number of processing, queued, or finished jobs. There is also associated time of when those jobs were entered into the associated queues, and at the very bottom is the scan period of, in this case, 300 seconds or 5 minutes. So let me now show you the additional step that needs to be performed or entered into the CFG file for either the framework or the Metastore to enable the event handler. So let's go into the Metastore CFG file and look at the configuration. So if I edit the control point Metastore CFG file and I highlight the additional components that need to be enabled inside the CFG file. So there are three areas that really need to be changed. Under the actions heading, we need to add two new parameters at the very bottom, and I'll highlight them now. On start and on finish. So basically the on start says when there's been a task which has been started, we're going to go down to the configuration section for normal events and perform whatever's defined under normal events. And very similar, the on finish, when there's a task that has completed or finished, we would go to the section inside the config file called finished events and perform what actions are defined there. So this is the first stage of which we need to add into either the framework or the Metastore. It's the same configuration for both. We do have to modify the parameters slightly, but in essence, the actual items you're adding to the config files are the same. So the other components that we need to add are the sections inside the CFG file for normal events and finished events. So if we scroll to the bottom of the file, so you can see at the bottom here, there is two sections been added, one for normal events, and under the normal events, basically we define the type of event handler we're going to use, and in this case it's an HTTP handler, and then the URL that are associated with events that is generated. And it's the same for the finished events. Again, we're using the HTTP handler and the address of where events are going to be registered when they either can start or finish. So you may recall that we added the highlighted text into the control point ingestion monitoring software configuration. So remember I said that for the Metastore, we normally take the ports that's associated with the Metastore, so 4500, increment it by 5, so we end up with 45005, and then to make it unique, some form of unique reference. So here we've added the name of the server and also giving it a unique qualifier for this particular Metastore process. Again, if we had a second Metastore process, we would call it exactly the same, but we would change the number from 1 to 2. So our original thoughts when we were designing to accept these event handler messages was that we would probably need to have multiple listener processes running inside our application. But upon testing, we found that it was very, very efficient, and that we could actually accept hundreds of connections quite easily without impacting performance. So we found that we didn't need to have separate definitions for both of these, and that we could have the same definition for both events which were being started and finished. Hence they are the same. Our initial thoughts that they might have to be different, but on testing we don't find any issues at all, so hence why they are exactly the same. So that really concludes the process of configuring the framework and the Metastore. The next short video will go into how to configure the additional components, so the content engines and services. Thank you very much.